Hello, everyone. Welcome to the next panel for N3Con, and thank you so much for joining us today in this digital conference. Our panel will discuss protests and how to cover social unrest innovatively, fairly, and safely. Very, very topical given the past year in Hong Kong and indeed events all over the world, including Belarus, the US, France, nearly everywhere we can think of these days. Joining me today is Tiffany Leong, reporter at Stan News, LAUREL CHOR, freelance producer and photographer, EMMANUEL, the security on the field and safety advisor for AFP, STANTON SHARPE, freelance photographer, and I myself am Shivani Matani. I am the Hong Kong and Southeast Asia bureau chief for the Washington Post, and I'm based here in Hong Kong. Really excited to be with you guys today. Thank you so much for joining. And I guess I'm going to start, just by talking to everyone here about their experience, last year, particularly with the events on the ground in Hong Kong, which were, an exceptional challenge for journalists, no matter the medium, the publication, and no matter who their audience was. So maybe we can start with Tiffany. I know Stan News is relatively new here in Hong Kong, and last year was really at the forefront, in documenting the protests using live streams and sort of that kind of rolling sort of coverage of the protest. Why was that sort of why was that approach taken to protest coverage here in Hong Kong and at Stan News? I mean, how did you guys decide, where to be given how things were so dispersed every night and how things were so chaotic?
Yeah, in Stan News, we focus on reporting from the protest live because we see that last year in Hong Kong, the protest in Hong Kong is in such a large scale and continuous and intermittent. And as a reporter, we never meet it in Hong Kong. So why we decide to use the medium of like using live stream to reporting something, because sometimes we start a live like 4 to 5 hours, no matter there are any clash or just it is very peaceful. We turn on and live to make sure that everyone, the audience, can take a look into the issues. And we think that when there are some clash, the live video can be very strong evidence for people to see what happened and why it is happening and the detail. And we just, as a reporter, we need to narrative to describe what is happening on that moment. And when there are no clashes, they are peaceful, we can try to interview some of the protester or demonstrator about why they are going to here and what they think about the protest like this.
And Laurel, I know you were obviously at the forefront of so many of the high points last year in Hong Kong, including the clashes at PolyU. As a freelance photographer, I mean, what did you have to keep in mind in deciding where to be, every Sunday or every night that this was going on, and how did you sort of make those decisions for yourself, especially working, pretty much as a solo, freelancer covering this?
I mean, I think what was really amazing about the protests last year was just the amount of resources out there, kind of crowdsourced resources with Stan News, and their live streams were a huge resource. Someone, I don't even know who, made this website you can go to where it loads every live stream there is, and that often gives you a bird's eye view of what's happening. There's WhatsApp groups with a lot of solo journalists like ourselves, which at least 2 of us are in, 3 of us in this group are in. So a lot of sharing resources. Twitter was a huge resource. With the protests, often having multiple protests happening at the same time, you couldn't be there all at once. You kind of did have to, first of all, figure out what was happening, then make a decision on where to go, which is really tough. I think some people just had better instincts than others. I was probably somewhere in the middle. I was often not in the right place at the right time, or you'd get there too late and then, something would happen in the place where you just left. So it was definitely difficult. And I think that's also where, having so many local journalists was so beneficial to the story, because you know, we know the city, we know how to get around quickly. Oftentimes, like, you know, you'd be on the MTR and you'd be like crammed in a train with like 10 journalists and 10 first aiders. So it was an art, I would say. And, you know, it's the same kind of struggles of anyone having to follow the protest. You know, on major days like the big strikes, you know, people kept comparing it to a giant whack-a-mole game across the city, you know, with the be water strategy of the protests. The police are trying to chase them, you're trying to chase them, and you're just kind of all over the place. It's a lot of luck too. A lot of research and luck and resource sharing.
Stanton, you were here in Hong Kong and now you're back in the US. How have some of the lessons, you know, from your experience on the streets in Hong Kong, sort of guided you as well in covering, you know, the Black Lives Matter protests? And what are some of the similarities you've seen between the two, and you know, even the approaches really to covering it?
Yeah, so some of, like, I think the main thing that I took with me from Hong Kong to the BLM protest was probably how to navigate around the police, I think, and navigating around protesters. I think one of the biggest challenges I had covering both protests was, I think with like facial recognition, I think there's like serious consequences. You can incriminate someone for having their face on a photo or a video of them doing something like destroying a building or doing something violent. And even in Hong Kong, especially after the NSL, I'm not sure what it's like there now. I haven't been there since December, but I'm sure that's even a bigger issue. In terms of the BLM protests, when I got there, when I got back to the States, yeah, I think just one of the biggest lessons I took back was discretion with what you're shooting while still telling the full true story. I got a lot more in the States. Actually, I got a lot more resistance from protesters from everything I was shooting, especially with looters. If you were shooting looters, it was not a very safe situation to photograph. But yeah, I think in terms of the protests in general, I think there was a lot of similarities in the fact that it was two, like, you know, disenfranchised groups who felt like the rights that they deserved were getting taken from them on both sides. So it was a very similar tone and feeling at both of the protests. But yeah, so a lot of similarities.
Emmanuel, you know, you're coming at this from a perspective of safety and security. I know for all of us in Hong Kong last year, this was such a new thing, right? A lot of lessons were learned on the ground and on the field and in real time. Maybe you can talk about how some of the common things that you've seen journalists do that perhaps, you know, were not really the wisest, and things that we can sort of kind of collectively learn from and improve, you know, in trying to keep up with these very fast moving events where you do have the pressure to kind of be in the center of the action, be at the right place at the right time, you know, and how you know, safety also has to kind of guide those decisions.
You okay, it's okay. What I can tell you is that within AFP a few years ago, when we were doing some trainings, security and safety trainings, there were trainings for people going to war, you know, going to cover some war and conflicts, etc. Now, after the Arab Spring, and I think that the Arab Spring is a turning point when demonstration riots began to be more and more dangerous for journalists. So we now do a lot more trainings for riots than we do for covering conflicts. That's the first thing. And we see some similarities around the world. And I was in Hong Kong last year to make a kind of training of our people in Hong Kong within AFP. One new thing is that now you can be targeted by protesters. a while ago, media were welcomed, by protesters because we were like, how to say, we were giving some audience or some voice to their recriminations. And now we can be targeted. It's very visible in France when with this movement of yellow vest, when protesters think that we do belong to the establishment, and so they can, punch and insult and be very aggressive against us, as they are against police and law enforcement people. And this is one thing. So we have to train against that. Another thing is that, 20 years ago or 10 years ago, it was easier because you could see easily who was law enforcement, who was protesters, and who was media. And now it's very much more difficult because even in the media group, you have so many people who say they are, journalists or covering, but they are doing so they are protesters and acting like journalists, or if they are filming for their own purpose, the purpose of the demonstration, for example. We do have YouTube links and everything in France of Yellow West, and they do cover what they want to cover. And it's very different of our way of covering a demonstration. And so we can be targeted by police or law enforcement as if we were demonstrations. And this is very hard for us. So we do trainings, and we do a lot of trainings. I work with some ex-law enforcement people who were, professional of law enforcement, and they can tell us where to stay, where to avoid crowds, how not to be, surprised by a movement of the police. Police is acting in a very predictable way, so it's more or less relatively easy when you are trained to not to put yourself in that street or in another one, etc. So we do some trainings like that. One thing we cannot avoid is the aggressivity of the demonstrators.
That brings us to actually a really interesting point, which was true in Hong Kong and indeed has been true in many other places around the world with journalists covering protests. I'm sure all of the journalists in this group have had experiences of being targeted in some way, being treated with some level of distrust from both sides. It'd be really great to hear Tiffany, LAUREL, and Stanton talk about how they dealt with that in Hong Kong, or perhaps with the BLM protests, and how you kind of negotiate those types of situations, with maybe some kind of specific examples. Whoever wants to go first, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, that last point rang so true for me, especially in the BLM protests with citizen journalists and activist journalists. They really create this this distrust of journalists on both sides. So you have police now have this mentality of you're not a journalist until you really can prove that you're a journalist. With like in LA, when I was covering the LA protests, you needed like a sheriff's approved press pass. And if you didn't have that, they would arrest you. And if you were, and there's generally a distrust of journalists amongst protesters too. So it's really strong, like we were talking about, and that's a hard thing to navigate. But I think for me, the best way that I've navigated that was a mentality of, if you're near the cops and you're covering the cops, you're essentially on their team right now. Like, you're with them. You're going to play by their rules. It doesn't mean you're not going to photograph everything you see, but you're going to play their game. And when you're with the protesters, you're going to play their game too. You're not going to be like a maverick when you have 30 people in your face telling you not to photograph. You're not going to say, F you, I'm a photographer, I'm a journalist, I'm going to shoot what I want. You got to learn how to get the story without sticking out like a sore thumb and while playing their game. So I think whatever side you're shooting, you're working with them. I think that's the most successful way to handle that in my experience. Okay. No.
I think as a local journalist to covering some protests, I think I'm already a lucky one because I don't even get some permanent hurt like, Indonesian journalist Weber. She was shooted by the police by the rubber bullets, and then she was blind. And for me, I think every journalist in local or even international one, they face some getting hurt in the protest. My camera was broken by because some brick was locked by the protester, and then my camera was broken. And then for the police, I have got a pepper sprayed with the reason, and just I even don't know who going to spray us because the police didn't give us any instruction and don't tell us the reason, and then we just get hurt. And I think that this situation happens many times. Like police will think us journalists are something try to disrupting their actions in the protests, and so they will using different weapons like pepper sprays, gun, and tear gas, or maybe water cannon. And this is actually we face it in Hong Kong.
I think, like Stanton and Tiffany said, you definitely get targeted by the police here in Hong Kong. So I think one interesting development for me, especially from last year to this year, last year, I would always wear my press vest. Especially when I was so chaotic, so violent, like you did not want to be mistaken for, someone the police could target or someone the protesters could target. So I always wanted, especially, as a local journalist, as a young woman, I can blend in with the protesters, and you don't want that. But this year, with so many new activists and citizen journalists on the scene, it definitely complicates the coverage or how you approach covering. I think, I actually wear a press vest less now because the citizen and activist journalists always wear press vests, and actually, I do want to differentiate myself a little bit from them, and they do get treated differently by the police. So, and again, with the protesters, there's definitely, especially at the beginning, I think last year there was more hostility when the Hong Kong movement was trying to figure out its relationship with the press. On July 1st, when they broke into LegCo, I encountered quite aggressive, pushing and, trying to block me with umbrellas. It's one thing if they covered themselves with umbrellas, but they were like following me around, trying to push my camera. But I never encountered that again. So it is this weird dance you have to navigate. And of course you get hostility from, not just protesters and police, but also like counter protesters, pro-Beijing people. I've been threatened by pro-Beijing people who didn't like the fact that I was a journalist. So, at the end of the day, you have to control your emotions and prioritize your own safety, and on getting out of the situation if you need to. I think even when you feel, as journalists, of course, we're there on principle, right? We're there because we believe in the freedom of press and the freedom and the importance of getting the word out. But ultimately, you still need to get out of there safe and in one piece. And instead of getting on your high horse, which sometimes they do want to do, you kind of just have to get out of there or play their game, like Stanton said.
That actually brings up a really important question of like what you wear and what sort of gear you bring, and how you identify yourself when you're out in the field. And that's obviously been a moving target, and it's different in different places. But Emmanuel, I'm curious what sort of your guidance is within AFP, and if you were also giving advice to freelance journalists in different places, how you would advise them in different circumstances, right? I know in some cases, being dressed in a yellow vest as people wearing in Hong Kong could actually make you more of a target rather than less, but in other cases, it does indeed help you. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that as well.
I think that, as it has been said, it's very important to be able to prove very quickly that you are a journalist. But we have to be aware that sometimes showing your press card can be an inconvenience. So what we advise to our people is to have a press card available, ready to show, but not having, some kind of physical signs seen by everybody that you are a journalist. Even if for our video people, we try to be very discreet, and we have small cameras, and we try to do our job kind of, more 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 discreetly than big TV channels. When you, for example, we don't have any more AFP signs on our camera, uh, because sometimes it can be a problem for us. So we want to be able to show very quickly to the law enforcement people that in fact we are a team of journalists, but we want also to be very discreet when we are in a zone where we only have protesters. And if we see a lot of citizen journalists, we try to get out. We just don't want to be that much inside, kind of a group of citizen journalists. In our trainings, we sometimes where all the equipments of law enforcement people, in order for our journalists to be able to see what do they see exactly. And then you can see that they don't see anything, because the helmets and the shields and everything are very dirty. So law enforcement people cannot differentiate you and cannot see that you are a real journalist or that you are a citizen journalist. So we advise our people to not to mess that much with citizen journalists. This is one point. And another thing which is basically new, and I know that I'm talking with a photograph, so it's more difficult for photograph, but we do advise our people to work in team. Because when you are 2 or 3, for example, a video journalist, when she or he is filming, you don't see anything but what you are filming in. Plus, the camera is a little bit tramp because it can give you the impression that you are away from the scene, when you are actually filming. So we do need someone, text or photo, to just have, to be the eyes of the video guy or girl, what she or what they cannot see. Sometimes we do, and we don't, I would say we don't like that, but sometimes we cannot avoid to be accompanied by guards. By people who are just bodyguards and watching what we can see. It happens a little bit in France, but it's very new. And of course, as you understand, it's not our way of working.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I just before we open up to questions, which are flooding in, I wanted to discuss with Tiffany, Laurel, and Stanton this idea of journalistic responsibility and bias. Over the past year, and sometimes being on the front lines of protests, it can be a very emotional thing, especially when you yourself are targeted, by the police more often than not here in Hong Kong, but also by protesters or those on the other side. In this environment, which is very charged, very emotional, very sort of touch and go sometimes. How have you tried to stay sort of unbiased and neutral in your reporting, and how do you feel, how do you define journalistic responsibility as well in this environment, right? What is being fair? What is being, accountable to your sources in your story and also, your publication?
I can jump in. Yeah, I think it's a very good question, and it's definitely been a huge challenge, especially I think when you're reporting on a story at home, right? And that's something that affects you personally too. And especially as a freelancer, you don't have institutional backing, you don't have the colleagues to talk to. Thankfully, I think the Hong Kong journalist community is pretty great. But I think for me, actually, what's harder than, you know, this trying to make sure that you're unbiased and balanced in reporting is actually not falling into the trap of false balance or false objectivity. I think that actually has been the bigger challenge where, you know, as journalists, of course, you want to speak truth to power. You want to call out wrongdoing. You want to keep governments and the police accountable. But on the other hand, I think there is a lot of pressure. You feel, you know, what about the other side is a common thing that you hear. Like, why aren't you focusing on the police? Why are you only filming, or why are you filming the police so much? Why aren't you filming the protesters? So I think what was even harder for me was to you know, really think hard about my moral responsibility as a journalist to ignore these different pressures and to focus on what I think is right or wrong, of course, based on the facts and on what you witness, and not, you know, be swayed by this false objectivity that you do see a lot in the media, and that people do. A lot of people, I think, misunderstand the role of the media and think that there should be this like 50-50 balance, which I don't think is the case either. So that's been something I've been navigating, and I think seeing how the BLM protests are covered in the States and seeing the discussion in the media there really helps me, and seeing also how Black reporters in the States are really leading the way for how newsrooms are covering and how there's so much internal discussion about how that should be done. It's also been really helpful. And I think that's something that's lacking a bit here in Hong Kong.
Can I ask just can I add just something on that topic? I think that it's very important to understand that freelance journalists are the more vulnerable in the media circus covering riots. For example, I would say that when you are not a freelance, but when you are sent by a company, you have been trained, usually. You have some trainings. We do say, for example, within AFP, the situation was so violent in the few months or years ago that now we have a rule within AFP which says that safety is the most important thing when you're on the field is your safety. We won't never accuse you or say that why don't you have this photo or why didn't you make that film or whatever, because safety is really now the primary, the most important thing. And when you are a freelance, you're not, what you're trying to do is do your job and trying to do the best pictures and trying to do the best video in order, to be able to live, So I think it's really important that freelance understand that now through some channels like ECHOs, companies give some opportunities for the trainings, and that there are some trainings for freelance. And it's very important for freelance to be aware of that, and because I think that the enemy is loneliness. If you are alone when working, alone when reporting, and alone with the danger, in front of the danger, this is really very hard.
Yeah, going off that, I definitely can attest to covering alone from the George Floyd protest, covering alone versus covering with a group. The situation covering the protests in LA, there were probably the biggest situation in terms of riots was there would be peaceful protesters in one area, and then there would be the looting going on in a different area. And I believe because the police didn't have the manpower to get through these mass numbers of peaceful protesters to get to the looting, they essentially, due to curfew laws, arrested all of the peaceful protesters and then made their way to arresting looters street by street. And if you're covering a certain block or like a few blocks that was essentially lawless and anything could happen. And if you're alone, it's just, yeah, you don't have anyone looking over your back for you. And it just having even just one person you can rely on when you're out there is so helpful, and it makes you feel safer. And if you trust that person, you know that you are safer because someone's looking out on your back. Going off what LAUREL said, I'm trying to remember what we were talking about, responsibilities to the story. Oh yeah, trying to be unbiased. I think it's really interesting. I know in Hong Kong, especially in Hong Kong, when it became this kind of movement way beyond Hong Kong as well, right? So it was a huge topic in America, it's a huge topic around the world, and I feel like there became this general line of story that you could play, right? And there were the shots that you knew would sell, and there was the storyline that you knew was very popular. And it was very tempting to, shoot the police and make them look as much like a stormtrooper as you could, right? Like those shots were, they were fun to take, and they were interesting. They looked interesting. But I think trying to find the humanity on the police side, it tells a more full story. And I think especially even in a time when there's a lot more instances of police defecting from the police force in Hong Kong now. I think if we could have gotten more of those humanizing stories of the police, even, I think it would do those defecting policemen more justice now, and would give a more human story to the whole situation. But obviously that's a really hard thing to do in a place like Hong Kong with the Hong Kong police who, in my experience, didn't want to cooperate in that way in any capacity. So it's hard, I think.
Tiffany, do you want to add anything about,
Yeah.
journalistic responsibility and yeah.
Yes, I think this is a very crucial questions to all journalists, especially us in Hong Kong, because we are also Hong Kong peoples. Sometimes we have emotions, and sometimes for us, maybe we have some anger also. So for me, when I'm working at the area of protest, I just, when I am live streaming, I just describe what I see, just not adding any judgment. And for something we try to investigate, or we want to have some judgment, we do it after that day. We try to investigate in a deeper investigation articles. And on the other hand, is we know that there are any narration between both parties, like the government and police, and also the protester. They have their narrative. So what we put much more effort nowadays is we try to fact check anything. Like we fact check the what is happening on the event or the protest, and we reform the timeline and revising the timeline like this. And also, I think because one of the things too concerning about the professionalism of journalists is because we can see that sometimes nowadays in the protest, journalists become the center of the event, the news event. And because we are getting hurt by the police or we are targeted. So sometimes we just like a human, we have emotion. So, but in this moment, I will be very concerning about to calm down and don't express any of my emotions or anger towards the police at that moment, because I think that this is our professional, and to stay how to avoid being criticized by others like this.
Great. Yeah, well, thank you guys so much for that discussion. We're going to move to questions because there seem to be quite a few. I'm going to start with one by Shauna Chen over here, who's asking this question, I think, on Facebook, saying, how do you navigate the ethics of shooting and reporting on violent scenes, and do you ever intervene? And it'd be actually kind of good to hear from Emmanuel on this as well, on the guidance and the training you give, right? I mean, and what the obligations are. But yeah, whoever wants to jump in.
I can jump in here. I think that's also something that's really hard. You know, I think generally the principle is you're not supposed to intervene at all, ever, right? I think. But I think there were a couple of times when I did feel like I had to. You know, there were instances when protesters were beating up counter protesters or people who didn't support them, and you know, it's hard because you want to document what's happening and you don't want to change the story or become part of the story. But then if someone's life is not in your hands, but if you can do something to prevent someone from dying or from very, very serious injury, I think you should do something. And you know, I have a journalist friend who once said to me, human first, journalist second. And I think in these instances, for me, whether or not other people would agree with me, there were a few instances when I did step in. Thankfully in Hong Kong, I think the protesters do respect journalists for the most part. And I knew that even if they're being violent towards this one person, if I stepped in, I'd be okay, and they'd respect that, and maybe it snapped them out of it. But I think there have been a few situations in Hong Kong where if journalists had intervened, like someone would have possibly died.
Yeah, going off Laurel, I think I always told myself that, you know, like to stay true to like be a true journalist, you know, you got to not intervene. But I think especially like when I have the first options of intervening, like in Hong Kong, there was a time where an anti protester was removing some of the barricades that the pro-democracy protesters had built, and they started, you know, beating her. The big group started beating her, and it was like, I think 20 journalists surrounding her with like 30 protesters all attacking her. And at that point we all intervened. So, I mean, I think at some point, like you said, like human first, journalist second. I don't see the value in not intervening. I don't think it makes you any less of a true journalist. I think sometimes you can intervene, you know.
For me, I think as a reporter, I try to not to intervening the events and also not escalating the issue and other situations. And of course, for me or for all of us, we witness a lot of bloody or violence seen in the protests. So what I can do, I believe, is to record it or document it in a video, or just have the video or live, and it speak louder than our words. I believe. Yeah.
I think we should not intervene when it's, you know, law enforcement people against protesters or protesters against law enforcement people, because we are just witnessing, and our way to intervene is just to witness and just to, you know, film and make photos and describe the scene. Now we are citizens above all, which means that if someone is, you know, dying or locked down or aggressed by people, of course we have to intervene. I mean, but we are in that situation. We are not journalists anymore. We are just, you know, the ordinary people helping other people. But when it's, you know, when it belongs to the scene, to the purpose of the manifestation, I don't think we should intervene now.
There's a question here from Jay Ganglani saying his question is, you know, well, protesters and journalists always taught the importance of maintaining personal safety, but have any of you put yourselves at risk when perhaps you shouldn't have done so?
I mean, that's like anytime you're at a protest, right? Like you don't have to, especially as a freelancer, you don't have to. So it's always about mitigating those risks. I think it's really important to know what risk you're personally willing to take, and to prepare for everything to, you know, make sure you if you can, do a hostile environment training. Another thing that I think was interesting about the Hong Kong protests was it sort of escalated gradually, and everyone sort of, the standards for violence sort of rose and rose and rose gradually for everyone involved. So we kind of had like a learning curve. So, I mean, I don't think there was any time when I felt like I had got myself in too deep or that I was unprepared. But I do take safety very, very seriously. I have always, of course, a helmet. I'm sure everyone here, helmet, gas mask, which also, after the incident where the Indonesian journalist was shot in the eye, I moved up to a ballistic grade face mask that could take a rubber bullet at least to the face. For a period last year, especially when there were a few live rounds, I would wear a Kevlar vest. So, you want to, I think it's about situational awareness, knowing your own limits, knowing your own capabilities, because that's sometimes different from what you think. Sometimes your physical and mental capabilities are not always aligned. So that's something to be aware of. In Hong Kong, I think, yes, there were risks, but it wasn't, a war zone. There weren't like live ammunition that you had to deal with all the time, every day. So that's also something to keep in mind.
Yes, I think it's a very important point. Putting yourself at risk doesn't only mean physically, it can mean mentally. We do some debriefings after every report which has been tense, like, war, of course, riots, demonstration, and natural disasters coverage. So we do some debriefings, and sometimes we notice during those debriefings that people were much more mentally and how to say, their soul was much more hurt than physically. So it's very important to be aware, where is your limit? We do know, I mean, it's easy when it's on a physical field, because, okay, if you are in the middle of a violent scene, of course, you know that you're in danger. But it's also important to be aware of our limits in terms of mental health. I remember one of our video people, she was covering yellow vest in France, and she was insulted during hours and hours by protesters. And she's a woman, so I mean, you know that basically when you are a woman, you are much more insulted than when you are a man, and plus you have the sexual aspect of insult, against you, which men don't have, and they don't suffer that, and it's very important to say that. And so at the end of the day, she was just absolutely upset. She couldn't go to work the morning after, etc., etc. So I give this example in order to say that be aware of your limit. We cannot absorb everything of the violence during a full day of violence, physically, but also mentally. I think it's important to notice that.
Yeah, that actually is a good segue into the next question by Heidi Lee, which is, how do you deal with your mental health when you've seen so much violence and even personally experienced it? Maybe Tiffany, Stanton, and Laurel as well can share that, and how you sort of decompress and keep in the story, especially in a situation like Hong Kong, where obviously each week sort of brings some new struggles and new pains as well. Yeah.
I remember there are twice that I feel very depressed and I cannot eat and I want to vomit and something like this. I know that my mental cannot suffer more and more. Once is like on November last year, because there are some protest related people. They university student. He died and fall from a car park because next to the protest venue. And this is the first time that people that his death is closely linked to the protest or the movement. And I feel very depressed because I think of when I think of he has a similar age with me, and just like another important moment in the movement, and I feel depressed. So what I can do is just take a holiday, a short holiday, to ignore some not looking about any reading some news, or but just keep some distance between my role of reporter and to interview in some protests. Just keep some distance between this one. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one thing to note is like if you think about the like just physically what you're doing to your body, if you think about, say it's a week of intense protests, like your schedule is probably going out in the morning or in early afternoon, and you're covering until maybe either all night or 2 a.m. or whatever. And as soon as you get home, you're uploading photos, you're editing, you're sending it out. And if it's an intense protest, you have a ton of adrenaline, and some people really like that. And that's part of the reason probably why I think a lot of journalists like to cover these situations. But you have a huge come down after that too. And that can lead to depression just physically in itself. And that's something, if you're aware of it, I think makes it a little more manageable. Also, something interesting covering the BLM protests after covering Hong Kong for a few months was, I talked to so many like local Hong Kongers, and hearing their perspective of everything that's going on in their city, it was easy to sympathize, but really hard to empathize. And then covering the BLM protests, where partially it was taking place where I like right down the street from where I used to live, and seeing like places where I would eat are completely smashed, shops I would go to completely smashed, people suffering, and people very like vitriolic, like with pure anger and hate, and people who are so fed up with like the life they've been handed in the country, in the city that I grew up in. When it's your own city and it's your personal city, that can hit you a lot harder. So I definitely can empathize more with Hong Kongers now. So I think that can play a part in it. And I noticed that I got a lot more tired covering the Hong Kong protest or the BLM protests. I think most of it was like kind of depression based on that, maybe.
Oh, sorry. Mental health is so important. Self-care, everything. You have to be so proactive about it. You have to be so diligent about it, just as you would with anything else. There's been so many statistics now and studies done on journalists in Hong Kong, and basically, like, especially if you're a journalist, you obviously have a lot of journalist friends. Like, everyone is almost everyone is experiencing to some degree some depression, some anxiety, and I see there's so much stigma about it, especially in Asia. Hong Kong, the stigma is so bad. I'm on antidepressants. I've been on antidepressants over a month now, and I want to talk about it because I am so sick of talking to journalist friends and seeing them suffer and not seeking help for it, because for whatever reason, embarrassment, shame, guilt, or feeling like they deserve to feel bad considering everything's going on when they witness so much suffering. So it's so important to take care of yourself. And we're in this job for the long run, and these problems, these issues aren't going to go away. So you really have to take care of yourself. And one phrase that I like to borrow from Lisa Witter, who's a leadership coach, is protect the asset. Yourself is the biggest asset to your work, and you have to protect that the best you can. And whether that's meditation, exercise, getting enough sleep, nutrition, find out what works for you, and be very aware of your limits, and be proactive about getting help. Better early than late, and better late than never.
Yeah, it's extremely well said from all of you. And there are a lot of questions here about the national security law, which is obviously the big elephant in the room that is, you know, at the back of all of our minds here. It's kind of difficult to choose one, but I'm going to choose this one because it's a bit all encompassing and we can sort of discuss things around there. What do you think about the recent stream of New York Times, WSJ moving their offices, or in some cases considering to move their offices because of the new national security law? But I guess the broader question here would be, what are the future plans for the foreign press? Is it sustainable to have press freedom in Hong Kong, and what sort of pressures are you under, and do you feel right now? And I think, you know, it's really valuable to hear from LAUREL as freelancer, and Tiffany, who's obviously, you know, Stan News local media, because, you know, that's in my opinion an even bigger risk than you know, being New York Times, Wall Street Journal, or in my case the Washington Post. So yeah, curious to hear from you guys.
Tiffany, do you want to go ahead, or?
I think definitely some reason because of the new national security law, and also we know there are many cases about the foreign journalists. They cannot get some working visa in Hong Kong to get into Hong Kong and work. And this is a situation seen last few years, not only about the national security law, but we can foresee that there are more foreign worker of journalists or maybe related to media cannot enter Hong Kong for working in the future. Yes. And concerning about where were there any pressures of the press from the government? I think that for the government or the police, they don't actually need to add some pressure to the media. They don't need to have a verbal one. They just need to have some means or tactics, try to classify what is the media they trust or they recognize. Or others for the citizen journalists or maybe some online media, they don't need to, they don't recognize them, and not inviting them or allow them to join the press conference organized by the government. This is some means, I think, that trying to suspending the freedom of press, and we can see that there are more and more suppression towards on this side.
I think the only thing that I think has changed really is, for me personally, is you just have to be a lot more understanding of anyone's concerns about speaking to the media. The risks are so high, the stakes are so high. You cannot, I mean, of course, already you don't want to pressure people, but you know, it usually, for example, with video reporting, you'd probably just keep asking people until you found someone who's willing to show their face, for example. But now, like, I'm not going to do that. You know, and also, like, especially if you're working with editors who are abroad, maybe, who don't quite understand, like, the pressure is kind of on you. The onus is on you to make sure that the journalists you're working with understand what's at stake. So I think, yeah, just being, you know, and also visually, that's a lot harder too. So even as a photographer or, you know, a producer, I did a portrait series recently, and quite a few of them are from behind. Normally I wouldn't do that, but in this situation, that's, of course, totally fine.
I have one point to add. Like for after the national security law, as a reporter or journalist, we need to provide more protection to our sources or interviewees. Like we will immediately destroy any conversations or transcript after we finish the article. And before the national security law, I delete some of the contents with some protester, and also someone maybe they are in foreign other countries, but they are involving into some international persuasions, which is against the national security law. I delete the content with them because to protect them and try to maybe avoid some surveillance we cannot know yet, like this.
We just have 5 minutes left, but maybe we can hear a little bit from Emmanuel about how whether your training does cover that, making sure that sources are kept safe and dealing with that relationship, right, between the journalists and their sources, and how you keep them safe as well in this environment, even at a protest, even on the streets.
I would say this would be a second phase of the trainings, because now we are more focused on the safety of the journalists, on the protecting sources. Each situation is very different. In Hong Kong, there is, I understand there is this situation, and but you have to be aware that, for example, in France or in Belarus or in the US, we don't have that much kind of thing that we have to protect our sources, because they are just people demonstrating, and they are, I would say, very happy to say all their angers in front of journalists, So it's very difficult. It's very different than the Hong Kong situation. And I don't know exactly how our Hong Kong people work on that. I'm sorry, I didn't ask them.
Stanton, did you run into this at all in the US as well, about anonymity, about people, being much more cautious about, how they want to be perceived, whether they want their face shot or not, and how did you sort of navigate that, even with that experience of Hong Kong, but using it in the US?
So in Hong Kong, like you guys all talked about, you have to be really careful. In the US, it was interesting. It kind of brings everything together. At first, you'd get some, amongst protesters, you'd get a lot of backlash for photographing. There was one protester who got really angry with me for photographing peaceful protesters, because he had actually assumed that I was a citizen journalist. I had credentials and everything, but when I told him I was a journalist, he goes, "Oh, you're actually a journalist. I thought you were just doing this for your own gain." So the immediate assumption is that you're a citizen journalist, and that's interesting. But also, I think with the looting, that was the biggest. That was the biggest kind of situation where I don't think that anything that I photographed of looters really got published. But if I was posting live footage online of looters, I got a lot of anger by just viewers that were looking at my stories. They thought that it was kind of a how dare you ever film looters, you're going to incriminate them, nothing about riot photography, what are you doing? And I don't know, I have an issue with that, because you need to cover that aspect too, and it's a difficult situation, especially when in the United States, it's extremely polarized right now, where one side can do no wrong and neither can the other. So it's an interesting situation, and people are only getting more aggressive about these things. So we'll see, leading up to the elections, probably going to have to face a lot of the same stuff.
For sure. Well, on that note, I think we're almost out of time. Thank you so much for joining us. And there are some questions I didn't get to, but I'm sure you know where to find all of these guys, and I'm sure they'll be happy to answer any more questions you have. But thank you so much, Tiffany, Emmanuel, Laurel, and Stanton, and thank you all for tuning in.
Thank you, Shivani. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.